Here's what you've been missing over at patreon.com/addressinggettysburg. We are done.
Cool. Yeah, that was fun.
Good.
You guys are great.
Thank you.
You're listening to Addressing Gettysburg.
For perspective, I spoke to both Scott Hancock, Associate Professor in History and Africana Studies at Gettysburg College, and Jason Martz, Acting Public Affairs Officer for the Gettysburg National Military Park. Professor, thank you for being here. We've agreed to socially distance and drop our mask for this conversation. Tell me about the Mississippi statue.
Well, this is the Mississippi State Monument, and it was erected in 1973. It's one of 9 of the 12 Confederate state monuments that goes up during the Civil Rights era, immediately thereafter. And there are other monuments to the Confederacy, but most of them are regimental markers. And so what's different about this is it's a state monument, like the Virginia, North Carolina, and the others. So it has a more political message because of when it went up and some of the things that it says on the description of the monument itself. Well, the inscription says that these brave sires fought for the righteous cause.
Which is what?
Well, I would argue, and any legitimate historian today would argue, the cause was slavery, that the organizing principle of the Confederacy was slavery. But when this monument goes up, they're saying the cause is something much more abstract. It's about individual rights. Things like George Wallace, when he spoke of the dedication of the South Carolina Monument, said it was about protecting the constitutional and individual rights of the South, which everybody knew what he's talking about was resisting federal orders that they had to desegregate. And it was about maintaining a certain kind of racial hierarchy in the South.
So what message do you think was being communicated in the early 70s with the erection of this statue?
I think it's very much about protecting this and communicating this identity of how some white Southerners, certainly not all, wanted to see their past. And that was a past that didn't have anything to do with slavery, didn't have anything to do with black people, didn't have anything to do with the several thousand slaves that were here in the battlefield. And they actually started talking about erecting this monument in 1962, so it took them a while to get it in place. And when they wanted to put that inscription on, actually the superintendent at Gettysburg National Military Park at the time said, you can't put that on there. The Mississippi committee got a state Supreme Court judge to weigh in. It went back and forth for a while. The superintendent left, not because of this, I don't think. The new superintendent who came in was from Mississippi, a white man, and he okayed it.
We all learned, back in the day, that you and I are now standing at the location of the seminal battle of the Civil War, the greatest bloodshed of Americans on any battlefield in the United States. Does the context matter to you? And what I'm asking is, do you apply the same frame of reference to what's behind you that you would to a statue of a Confederate soldier in a town square?
I think the context matters tremendously. So those statues in town squares that aren't situated on the battlefield and are not situated because of the consensus of people in those towns, because it's not like they're talking to the black folks in those towns. For me personally, I'm all in favor of those coming down. These, because it has an educational value, I think are a bit different, significantly different, because it is about pointing to the battle. That's the way the statue is facing where Pickett's charge was. But what I would love to see the Park Service do, and I think they're thinking about this, is not let that statue communicate a one-way message, because that one-way message is that they had a righteous cause. Well, I would say their cause was to maintain the institution of slavery. There's nothing righteous about it. So for me, it's not so much about taking the statue down as educating visitors about why that statue went up, that it went up to maintain white supremacy.
If I go to the visitor center, I'm told that story.
Yes. Yeah.
You think there needs to be a different telling on the battlefield?
Yeah, so the visitor center does a great job with all this stuff, right? And they have thought about that very intentionally. I think the National Park Service are very aware that the battlefield communicates a very different message in the visitor center, because in the battlefield, there's no references to slavery. There's only a couple of references to any black presence on the battlefield. There's no references to the fact that the Confederate Army kidnapped free black people when they retreated from here. So if you never went to the visitor center and you spent 3 days in the battlefield, you'd have no idea that the reason there's a battle here in the first place is because of slavery, because of enslaved black men and women. So I think they need to make the battlefield line up with what the visitor center does.
So I'm curious, as the nation is now embroiled in a conversation about what to do with these icons of the Confederacy, has there been controversy here at Gettysburg?
There has not.
What do you think differentiates from the town square and the debates that we see playing out all over?
What you see here at Gettysburg is a time capsule. It is a window to the past. This is where those soldiers fought. Approximately 165,000 soldiers fought each other on this surrounding ground for 3 full days in July of 1863. They were here. The men from Mississippi were here. The men from Louisiana were here, and so forth, all across the battlefield. So that the tangible connection to the place and the men who fought here is unlike anywhere else.
What about the issue of some of them having been erected post-civil rights era, almost as if sending, maybe not even almost, sending a message?
Sure. That also is a window for us as National Park Service employees to be able to educate the public, not just about those 3 days in July of 1863, but in various eras and decades throughout the history of the United States that led to some of these monuments being placed here in the first place. And so some of these monuments have some lost cause feel to them, but that's endemic to when they would have been placed here throughout the 1900s.
Is that therefore grounds to have them removed?
We don't think so. In fact, all of these monuments here on the battlefield fall into one of two categories. They were either congressionally mandated, so it would take a congressional mandate to remove them, or they fall under a length of history that they've been here so long they are an intrinsic fabric of the battlefield as much as the battlefield is. So removing them really isn't necessarily an option. They are here in perpetuity. So it's our job to, at that point, educate the public about when these monuments would have been placed, at least those that certainly have an offensive view to them.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to this episode of Addressing Gettysburg. And as you may have guessed from the clip that you just heard, we are talking about Confederate monuments here at Gettysburg National Military Park. And with us again, first time in person, is Scott Hancock, the Associate Professor of History and Africana Studies at Gettysburg College. Welcome, Scott.
Thanks. It's great to be here.
It's great to finally have you in person. I always prefer to do these things in person, especially for the first time, because it's weird to talk to somebody over the phone. You haven't met them.
Yeah.
So it's nice that...
I agree.
Yeah. Okay, so let's start off here. We heard the Smerconish interview, but if you want to go into a little more detail, give us in a general sense what your view of the Confederate monuments at Gettysburg is.
Yeah, and that's the important part, right? At Gettysburg, because
Right.
like Confederate monuments and other places that are going down, I'm all for that. Most other places. I think the ones on the battlefield at Gettysburg National Military Park, so we've got the two different kinds, right? Some of them, the majority of them are regimental markers, those kind of things, and those are educational. I think they've got, who served casualties, just like the Union markers. I don't think those are particularly controversial. But like all monuments, they still sanctify and sanitize the battle.
Sure.
But, excuse me, but the Confederate state monuments are a different story because they're much more politicized. They went in for different purposes and different time periods, which we can talk about if you like.
Sure.
And those are the ones that would be the most egregious, I think, in a lot of people's minds. Like maybe those are the ones that should come down. If there was a movement to remove them from the battlefield, and if there was going to be a congressional bill, I wouldn't be opposed to that. But I'm not convinced that's the most practical strategy, the most pragmatic, because one, as you probably know, it literally takes an act of Congress.
Yeah.
They have to be removed from federal land.
You point out in the interview that Congress put them up.
Right, yeah.
Right. Or
So
allowed them to be put up.
So I think that's a battle that we're probably not going to win anytime soon. It's going to be protracted. It's going to be long. And so I just in thinking about that, are there other ways that we can think about those monuments? And I think they're actually a teaching opportunity. And I think some of the folks, NPS folks, probably see them that way too. That if we use them to educate the million or close to million visitors who come through here every year about why they were put up and when they were put up and what their purposes were, then they're going to see those very differently and perhaps see the Confederacy and what the Civil War is about very differently.
Yeah. I agree, and I think that is the way to go. And the reason there's several reasons I think that. One is they in and of themselves are historical artifacts now.
Yeah.
Right. And most importantly, as you point out, they're teaching tools. They're ways that we can learn about not just one era of history, but more than one era of history. And they're both very important, and they're both related. So they should stay. I feel that if we're to call ourselves Americans, it's rather cowardly of us to hide from symbols. We should confront them and learn what they represent in its entirety. Right. So we shouldn't be afraid of the ugly stories attached to it. We should listen to those stories, and we should say, well, let's not do that again. And I think they're great tools for that. If we take them away, we've got nothing. It's as if, like, what was the Union fighting?
Right, and I think my qualification would be, I would say they could be great tools. I think currently they are not.
Correct.
Because currently they are teaching something, and what they're teaching is a bad history.
Yeah.
But we could flip that on its head. We could flip the script on those monuments.
And I think we should. And do you know, does the park have any plans to do that, put up markers or something that tells the rest of the story?
Yeah, so in this, I want to be careful because I don't want to, my goal is not to paint the NPS staff here in a bad light at all, because I think they're great. I think Chris Gwynn and Steve Sims and all and the other people that I've talked to, they see it very much as a teaching opportunity. They understand their mission is, their goals, as they tell me, is to preserve the park and to educate the public, and I think they take that really seriously.
Oh, they do.
And they don't want the lost cause narrative to be perpetuated.
Right.
So my answer to your question isn't meant as a criticism of them. I think they do have plans. I've been told they have plans. I would like to see those plans accelerated, but also understand it takes time. They've got bureaucracy, they've got people up the ladder that they have to deal with. But there are some of us, and not just me by any stretch, I think who've been hearing for a while that there are plans to do that. So I hope it's soon.
Well, I've heard on good authority, I won't say who, that they actually have markers made already. They're just waiting for permission to put them up. Have you heard that?
Well, I've heard there are markers. I haven't seen them.
Yeah.
And that they're going to be interacting with some of the folks who they've been talking to in the local community and historians and others about what those markers will say. I haven't seen the text for those particular ones about the Confederate state monuments, and not that they have to consult me, but
no. But you've been a vocal. I don't want to say critic, because I don't think you're being a critic, but your opinions are known.
Yeah. And
you're a professor at the college. I mean, you're not just some guy off the street. You're somebody.
Yeah. So I'm sorry. I need to put that on a T-shirt. I am somebody. But
we can make that happen.
Yeah. All right. Great. And that's where I don't know all the ins and outs.
Yeah.
So I want to be careful that I'm not sounding too judgmental, because I don't know all the steps they have, and if they're just waiting for permission, then whoever needs to give them permission, I wish they'd hurry up.
Yeah.
Because it's summer. I ride my bike on the battlefield all the time, and I see these high school kids looking at the North Carolina monument, looking at the Mississippi monument, and the Virginia monument, and wonder what they're hearing, what they're seeing. Those monuments, is a friend of mine who's a communications professor, David Seitz, who's a neighbor as well.
Yeah.
He told me years ago, after the Charleston 9 were assassinated, which is why I got kind of involved in this. It's a form of discourse. The battle flags, the monuments are all a form of discourse, and right now it's all one way.
Yeah.
So there needs to be ways to speak back into that discourse and correct the narrative. And,
I mean, after all, they lost.
Yeah.
So why do they? I mean, you make a good point. It's a little later in the conversation than I was thinking, but here. This is a quote from an interview you did in the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. You said the Confederacy, in the cultural and spiritual sense, actually won the Battle of Gettysburg. They have been successful in rewriting the history of the Civil War, that it wasn't about slavery. We've been saying this forever.
I would wholeheartedly agree with that statement.
Yeah. I grew up in New Jersey. Well, Eric grew up here in Pennsylvania. And I don't remember specifically what we were taught about the Civil War, but I know that the impression that I got between that and watching old Hollywood movies about the Civil War was that it was just a disagreement that the states had, and both were honorable. The soldiers on both sides were honorable, and they fought for honorable causes, and may the best man win, and the best man won, and now we're all friends again. And that was kind of the feeling that I got. And it wasn't until, I hate to admit it, but only a few years ago when I really started digging into this stuff, when I realized, no, that's bull. Like that's, we were talking about, Eric, what was it? I guess during the monumentation period, when the subject of putting Confederate monuments up came around, and the Union veterans were just as viciously against it as people are today, and that's not what you get out of Hollywood, and it wasn't what I got in the textbooks. And that's to me, that's the lost cause narrative just seeping into every aspect of our culture. Correct or incorrect?
Absolutely. And and I think where I would put more pressure on whoever is further up the chain that needs to give the permission to do this faster is, I think, the Gettysburg National Military Park and the people who have maintained it over the decades, they've been a part of that.
Yeah.
Right? They bear some responsibility to that. And I'm not just talking like in 1917 when the Virginia Monument went up, but in the rededication of the Virginia Monument in 1987, when you read some of the speeches, which I've got here, and some of the text.
Oh, I would love to get
They are just repeating that same thing. Can I read you an excerpt
Please.
so this is from Tennessee when it was put up in 1982. Right?
Okay,
So
1982, in my lifetime.
This is not the distant past. So the dedication speech, this is just part of it. The speaker says, after the war had ended and the smoke had blown away and the crack of the musket and boom of the cannons had dissipated into eternity, the stars that once graced Confederate banners and Gideons took their place back into Old Glory. The bars in those flags took their place as stripes in Old Glory, and all this truly made Old Glory the Star-Spangled Banner. May she wave forever, forever will she, by the grace of God. And then it goes on to say, resolve here today, the war between the states, right, war, not the Civil War,
right.
The war between the states, was won by Americans, of whom for a period of time some wore blue, others gray, as they fought a duel of honor on the field of honor, largely by men of honor, and so settled their differences in that fashion, just like you just said, man, right? They had different opinions.
Yep.
From out of which emerged a united nation. We must consider these men in blue and gray fought in order to preserve their beliefs and personal convictions. Now, it doesn't ever say what their beliefs and personal convictions were.
Right.
Right. But they're like we're all part of the family. We're all together.
Yeah. We just had a squabble.
Yeah.
That's all.
And you get the same kind of speeches when Maryland is dedicated, the Maryland Monument in 94. So this is something that the National Park Service has. They've reinforced and promulgated that narrative as well
by allowing that type of talk.
And so I think the Park Service has an obligation to help, and I think they want to. Like I said, I think they really want to. But, but I would like to politely, respectfully urge them to do it quicker.
My impression, and this is, I don't know, but my impression is that they're waiting more for like red tape in Washington.
Yeah.
I believe I was told that the previous administration had signed some executive order about not doing anything to monuments or something
kind of a moratorium on that.
And so that I think has to be undone, if I'm not mistaken, or something to that effect.
That doesn't
or at least
me.
That delayed any movement on it. And you know how government moves, it moves slow. So but I think I don't know, this is also based on nothing, but my gut feeling is that in the next year or two they'll be up. It's better than nothing.
While we're on that topic.
But now would be such a great time because it's topical. What?
Well, while we're on that topic, because I know my thoughts on this.
Yeah.
What would you like to see as far as interpretation goes? Like on, if it's going to be a wayside, and almost certainly it's going to be like a wayside, what would you guys like to see on that?
You want me to go first?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I think he was
So-
really talking to you.
Both of them.
Okay.
Well, I think wayside markers are important, right? Because people read them.
Sure.
My wife she loves history. She's one of these people, when she goes to museums or battlefields, she reads every word. So I usually take a book when I go with her.
Right.
Because
You're going to have some
she
time.
takes even longer than me. Yeah.
It's like my dad was that way.
Yeah, people read them, so that matters. But also, on the other hand, I recognize a 4 or 5 foot waist.
Catch the rest of this episode and support the show over at patreon.com/addressinggettysburg.